All right, our attendees are coming in as we speak, so give them a minute or so. I'll wait just a couple more minutes to let a few more people log on. And here comes Eric. Hi, Eric. Thanks for joining us. I think he's still logging in. Hi, Tom.
Hey.
How are you?
Good.
Good. All right, Eric. Looks like Eric is logged on. We have a few more attendees, so yeah. All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started. I want to welcome all of our attendees and thank our panelists for being part of this virtual ONC Lunch and Learn today, the last one of 2021. I wanted to first off start with a couple of small announcements. Due to schedule conflicts for all of our panelists, they're all going to have to log off right around 1, so we're going to have to shorten the session to just an hour. So if I don't have time to get to questions that our attendees type into the chat, I will respond to them via email. Hi, Eric. Nice to meet you. No, it's fine.
Earbuds to work. Sorry about that.
No, that's okay. Thank you. It's nice. I've never personally met you, so it's nice to meet you via Zoom. Thank you very much for being part of our discussion. I've already started the webinar, and I was just giving a couple of short announcements before we jump into our questions. The session's going to end right at 1 because everybody on the panel has some conflicts this afternoon schedule-wise, so we're going to get into our questions right away. I couldn't get any staff from the city attorney's office or the city clerk's office, unfortunately, to be part of the panel. So we're not going to address the question of what constitutes a ballot legislation versus a council legislation, because that's a pretty complex topic, and it's probably better that we have people from the city clerk and the city attorney's office here to help with that. So I hope to address that in a future Lunch and Learn next year. And I did also want to state for our attendees, because my office had a couple of questions, we're not going to be addressing any IDO related questions because none of us on this panel are subject matter experts on it. We don't have the background or the knowledge of it to address it appropriately. So I just want to let everybody know. Our attendees, if you do have questions, feel free to type them into the chat. If we have time, we'll get to them at the very end. Otherwise, like I said, I will email you the response. But we'll go ahead and get started. I want to introduce our panelists. We'll start with Julia.
Hi, everybody. My name is Julia Kuladon, and I'm an associate attorney here in Council Services.
Thanks for being part of it, Julian. Julian.
Hello, everybody. I'm Julian Moya. I'm the Public Information Officer for City Council Services.
Thanks, Julian. Tom.
Yes, hi. My name is Tom Minicucci. I'm part of the support staff at Council Services, and we support a lot with capital projects, transportation, and other issues. Just that.
Thank you. Diane?
Hi, I'm Diane Dolan. I work with Tom. I'm a special projects analyst that I focus mostly on capital projects. But prior to this position, I was Councillor Benton's policy analyst for about 10.5 years.
Yes, and Diane is technically on vacation today, so thank you for being part of the panel. I'm very appreciative. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Chris?
Good afternoon, everybody. Chris Silva. I'm with the Office of Neighborhood Coordination. I am a neighborhood liaison. Hi, Eric. And I also am a policy analyst part of the time with City Council. So I'm a subject matter expert on civilian police stuff and census, and you just name it, a jack of all trades.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you, Chris. And last but most certainly not least, Eric.
Hey, everybody. It's like homecoming week over here. I was like all these people I used to work with.
Like a family reunion.
Well, Tom, and I bugged Diane a lot, so she probably didn't receive it. Chris, it's good to see you, and Tom, and the rest of you. It's good to see you all. Thanks for inviting me. So I'm, you all probably know, for those in the webinar, I'm a recovering former city councilman, and still work a lot here in the Barrios neighborhood where I live, and try to work with other community folks who just to try to, and also I'm a lecturer over at UNM Public Policy. We talk a little bit about local economic development issues. I think I may have asked one or two of you come and speak at the class at one point, but anyway, it's great to be here. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm really glad you could be part of our discussion as well. So I'll give a little short, quick overview of why I wanted to have this virtual session. I was YouTube surfing one evening. I can't even remember what I was looking for. And all of a sudden the video from Schoolhouse Rock, all of you as old as me remember Schoolhouse Rock back in the 80s, it was this really great animated TV show on public access. I think it was, I don't know, Channel 5, whatever the public access TV was. And there was a really cool segment they did on how a bill is formed, and it was called A Bill on Capitol Hill. And it was this animated video about this little bill and how it becomes a law. And it really broke it down into like a very understandable, I thought, process. And it occurred to me that because I haven't been with the council that long, or in my position that long, I'm still learning a lot about how the process of legislation itself works. And I thought this might be a good topic for other people, both within our neighborhood associations and in the general public, to kind of have just a real quick overview of the process. I mean, how legislation comes into being is a very complicated process, but it's my hope that this general type of session will provide people with just a quick overview of not only how it works, but how ordinary citizens can get more involved in the civic process and make a difference. So I will go ahead and jump right into our questions. I'm going to start with Julia. Julia, I attend quite a few city council meetings, as do our attendees. And I'm wondering if you could explain something that has always confused me, which is what is the difference between a memorial, a resolution, and an ordinance?
Sure. So there is actually some overlap, and they're not super rigid in their definitions, but I'll try to give sort of a general overview with a couple of examples of each. First, a memorial. It's a type of legislation that issues a statement or a position on a specific topic by the council. So it doesn't create a new law. It's not legally binding. It's not a law altogether. It just represents a consensus of opinion by the councilors. For example, at the beginning of this year, the council adopted a resolution called Urging State Legislators to Adopt Policies and Strategies to Address Climate Change at the upcoming New Mexico State Legislative Session. And so what that is just a statement that climate change is something that's important to the council. And the council then encourages the state legislature to take action to address it at their legislative session. A resolution is legislation that states a policy or a position for the city, and it either mandates or prevents something from occurring. And they're generally used when the city wants to state a policy on the matter, but it's not drafted in a way that's regulatory like an ordinance. And resolutions are used for things like budget appropriations and approval of grant funding, establishing objectives or plans for the city overall, giving notice of local elections. Like there's currently a resolution related to the runoff election coming up for Council Districts 7 and 9. And then resolutions can even be used for stuff like setting the dates for the upcoming city council meetings coming in the next year. An ordinance is the only type of legislation that can create a new law, or they can also be used to amend existing law. Ordinance are always used for what's called police power legislation, which is matters that are criminal if not followed. And they're also used to adopt taxes and fees, organizational policies for the city, and organizational operational matters. A couple of examples from recent ordinances: the automated speed enforcement ordinance, the speed cameras, that's falls in the category of an ordinance, and then amending the transit system ordinance to provide a zero fare pilot program for city buses.
Great. Okay, thank you. Actually, that
Sure.
was very useful for me because I hadn't really understood what the difference was. So thank you for that, Julia.
Yeah.
The next question I want to address to Eric. Eric, many people in the community may not be sure about how to get more involved with the civic process or how to start the process of asking for legislation to be proposed. If a citizen wanted to ask for some type of legislation or for a change to existing legislation, how would you suggest they go about it if they hadn't previously had experience with the civic process itself?
Good question. So there are individual ways. So first of all, counselors, like generally speaking, are pretty accessible. First of all, I encourage everybody to get to know their city council person because they represent you. And I'll speak for myself. When I was on city council or when I was in the legislature, I had very few original ideas. They all came from people who were kind of trying to solve a problem or were kind of experts or really had been working on things. So I think some of the best ideas I had came from constituents. So there isn't some magic, room where they come up with these ideas. They come from people who are trying to solve problems in their community. There's now city council can't do everything, obviously. So, but I think as the example you just provided is they could even do a sense of the local government on memorial on any issue. So if you feel really strongly about something that the city maybe doesn't have the constitutional power to do, they can still make a statement about their values, right? Like global warming or like police reform or whatever the issue is. And then for the issues that are real tangible, like the nuts and bolts issues, like you have a problem in your neighborhood, there's multiple routes. Obviously, if you have access to digital media, to website, go straight there. I encourage you to go in straight, and generally speaking, you get a pretty quick response. You can always call 311 is a magic number, and they'll connect you with city council. They'll connect you with the department. It's worked pretty well. So I think if you're just trying to solve a problem. Now, if you have a kind of a legislative issue, like it would be great if we did what I just on the way over here from my other meeting, there was a story on NPR about how to make cities more pedestrian friendly, and there's Washington State and others doing some interesting thing, like, hey, they're doing this in Seattle or Portland or LA or wherever. Why don't we do that? Then I think that's the kind of thing you can bring directly to council just by reaching out to them, right? Email always works. Generally speaking, I've had pretty good responses as a community person. The other way to do it, and I know we got a lot of questions, but the other way to do it is, and you don't have to do it this way, is there's a lot of really active neighborhood associations, but they don't necessarily have to be the gatekeepers, but it's always good to work with existing organizations. So if you care about conservation issues, environmental issues, I know that groups like Sierra Club or are active on some of these local issues. If it's a neighborhood, if it's a crime issue, you can look up your neighborhood association and get involved that way. I'm a big fan of trying to communicate directly with your elected official. I'm sure the councils are going to all be crazy about the idea. I'm encouraging people to call them and email. Dan's not giving me the stink eye because she used to have to take a lot of these. She still probably does. All of you probably still have to take these calls. But I know that elected officials like to hear directly from their constituents about what's going on. And so I encourage you just to don't be afraid to reach out to them directly via email, via the website, and try to see if you have an idea and see if it gets any legs. Is that chat for me? Is that question I should try to answer, or is that somebody else?
We'll get to the attendee questions at the end if we have time. But I did want to kind of go off of what you were saying, Eric, with your background and already having been part of a city council and now being a general member of your neighborhood. Do you find that has given you the ability to kind of go out within your own community and talk to people and kind of engage them in the civic process?
Yeah, so I think that everybody, I'm also a political scientist, so I'm like a semi-academic now. So there's an issue called collective action. It's like people have lives and people have families and people have jobs. So it's really hard to expect people to go to meetings and everything. Some people just can't do that. So the question is, how do you get people engaged, right? So so if you don't have time to go to neighborhood association meetings, and now it's easier with Zoom and so on, there's always that direct route. But I think that some of the best ideas come from things we care about. So if you're a parent, if you're there's issues around like how do schools work more closely with the city, for example. So maybe it's a PTA meeting, and this happened at my kid's school. They said, we really need some kind of help with traffic around here, or we need some help with some community safety issues. And even though I don't live in that particular, like that was something that my activism with other parents in my neighborhood, when I'm walking my dog, that's often when I'll run into somebody who says, you know, we really need to, we really need to have a better crossing here. Or wouldn't it be great if we had a place where we could dump our, you know, our pet waste over here? Or there's really a problematic issue. I live by the Bosque here, by the river. Like there's a really kind of a problematic area here. And those are the things you can help to just bring to the attention by talking to your neighbors. So there's no magic way to do it. I think you can get involved certainly in your neighborhood association or in a civic group or a parent association, but you can always just access city government directly or your council person directly. And by the way, the mayor has folks too that are supposed to be responding to these things. So you can always reach out to the mayor's office as well.
Yeah, there's, like you said, there's many different venues of engaging with your city and your community and the civic process. So thank you for that, Eric. I appreciate it. This next question I want to address to Diane, Julian, and Chris. Can the three of you give me some recent examples of legislation that was introduced that was a direct result of a citizen suggestion?
I'll go ahead and jump in. The most recent one, I'll pass over to Eric after I've talked about some of these others. The most recent one, I think, is the requirement for a community benefits agreement that was tied to the legislation putting the stadium bond proposal on the ballot. And the Bareilles neighborhood approached Councilor Benton as one of the two preferred sites were in their neighborhood, and asked for a community benefits agreement that needed to be part of any process for a stadium. I'll let Eric go into more detail about that, but other legislation I've worked over the years that came from community members include revisions to the noise ordinance. So that had been sort of a long-running an issue that kind of kept popping up with neighborhoods, and it usually had to do with commercial and residential in close proximity, and the level of noise that was allowed. And it really came to a head in the downtown area where we had mixed use, where there might be a bar on the street level and condos on top of it. So a group of those condo owners had contacted us. They were just pretty regularly inundated from music from the bars around them. And so we worked with the environmental health department, who had already been doing some research. I had previously asked them to look into something called low frequency vibrations that had in the past not really been regulated anywhere, but have started being implemented. So that was really the neighbors coming to us and saying, this is a really big problem. Is there something we can do in the noise ordinance? So there were revisions to the noise ordinance that were made. Councilor Benton sponsored that legislation. Another one is food truck ordinance. We at one time really had no ordinance to sort of how do we deal with food trucks, and there was a prohibition against them using private property, even if they had that property owner's permission. So they were relegated to our public streets. We started hearing from business owners, and again, a lot of this was downtown, who had concerns about food trucks setting up right in front of their front door. And so they were asking for some sort of regulations. They weren't unsupportive of food trucks, but they were paying a mortgage and taxes, and at the time, even a special assessment into the bid. And they wanted to make it a little bit more fair. And so Councilor Benton sponsored a food truck ordinance that set up some regulations. First of all, it did allow at that point that if they had a property owner's permission, if a property owner had an empty lot and wanted to have a food truck, pod there, that they can now do that. There were restrictions placed on how close to a brick and mortar restaurant a food truck can park, so that they weren't, blocking the entrances to another business there. And there were some restrictions with respect to them in residential neighborhoods and where they could park and under what conditions. There was also some requirements for like trash cans and things of that sort. So that was another example, came from the community. And we worked to balance between the needs of the businesses, but we also wanted to support the entrepreneurship of the food truck business as well. And we did come back actually later and amend that based on the input. You know, sometimes we don't get it right the first time. So after a few months, we got additional input from food truck operators and APD as well that helped us do a little bit of tweak to that ordinance to make it work better for everybody. So those are a couple right off the top of my head that I had been involved with over the years.
Yeah, that's true. As we all know, there's no such thing as a perfect legislation, right? Can always work toward it, but it doesn't, you know, yeah, I get it. Chris, what about you? What is some legislation you've worked on in your time at council that came about as a direct result of citizens or neighborhood engagement?
Yeah, I love the question. This actually predates my time on council. I started with council in 2013. But in the summer 2011, the UNM School of Architecture and Planning and the Fair Heights neighborhood, at the time it was the Fair Heights neighborhood, they got together and the class did what was called a streetscape concept between Constitution and Lomas in the Fair Heights area. And what this was doing was it was a plan to make the area walkable and put in medians and beautify the area, bringing more redevelopment to an area that had been vibrant at one time, but now at the time had started to lose its luster. So when I joined council in 2013 with Councillor Gibson, this plan had already been in effect. The students made their points and showed the neighborhood, and the neighborhood discussed this, and the neighbors said, hey, let's actually do this. Let's make this a legislative process. So they approached Commissioner Hart-Stebbins at the time and Councillor Gibson to make these improvements. And what came about is, one of the things that came about it is there was a resolution made designating the area as the Mile High District, which is a nod to the commercial core of what it was during the 40s. And so Fair Heights was very happy to change their name. And with the resolution that was put forth between the counselor, the commissioner, well, the commissioner did her own resolution in her own body, but between the neighbors and Councillor Gibson called for improvements. And to this day, so far, some of the improvements have been street signage, lighting, the 50-mile loop goes through there. All of these things came about because of legislation and people getting together and saying, hey, that's a great idea. Tom Minicucci worked on this, and Diane Dolan is working on it now. So that's one of the things that I would like to put forth is citizens coming together and telling the counselor, hey, this is a good idea. Can you go for it?
That's actually really cool, because I did not realize that what the history was of the Mile High Neighborhood Association changing their name. So that's actually good information for me to have. Thank you, Chris. I appreciate that. Julian, you're in your current function, you're the council's public information officer, but you were previously policy analyst to former Councilor Ray Garduno. Were there some specific pieces of legislation that you worked on as his analyst that were a direct result of folks reaching out from that district?
Yeah, absolutely. My favorite example is the District 6 coalition at that time came to Councilor Garduno and said, we have a problem with people calling, our community a very derogatory term. And I won't say it, because of the movement that happened for this process. And that was a coalition and neighborhoods getting together and saying, we want to call ourselves in this neighborhood the International District. So the coalition had its own process and kind of developed that name. And they brought it to Councilor Garduno, and Councilor Garduno sponsored a resolution. And what that resolution did was basically, kind of to go back what Julie was describing earlier, made like a formal policy that this part of our city will be referred to as the International District. So that meant city departments, planning departments, city council departments, the police department, that if they were going to refer generally to this area, that it would be the International District. And it kind of from the from the ground up, it can look like a small thing, but when you kind of take the 3,000-foot view at kind of what has happened since then, kind of that little change and just kind of perception really changed a lot of things in that area. It still has its struggles, but you know, a lot of planning efforts went into that area. A lot of infrastructure improvements went into that area. There's going to be a brand new state-of-the-art library that's going to be called International District Library. So it was a good example of kind of neighborhoods coming to the counselor, and then it really kind of being an organic movement to get other improvements and other changes down the line.
That's really awesome. I hadn't realized that the name change for International District was a result of the District 6 coalition. So good job, District 6 coalition, right on. Another piece of legislation that I understand was a direct result of a suggestion actually from school children was the ban on plastic bags. Is that correct? I don't know who wants to address that, but.
Yes, Vanessa, that's correct. And that was an interesting one because it wasn't folks sort of limited to a geographic area like a neighborhood. So it was a group of school children and their parents, and they contacted their individual counselors. I second what Eric suggested, and that is the best place to start is with your own counselor. So this group had folks in a couple different council districts, and so they approached a few different counselors and were able to initiate this process to write a plastic ban ordinance. And this story also, though, I just want to make the point, at the end of the day, we did pass a plastic ban, and it was not necessarily a ban that everybody was happy with. And that's something to keep in mind as you're working with the city and working with counselors on legislation. They have to get 5 votes, 6 votes to be veto proof, and that requires some amount of compromise or nothing will get passed at all. So one of the compromises that ended up being made on the plastic ban was related to exceptions for restaurants. And then there was also an amendment during that adoption process that allowed the administration, specifically through the solid waste department, to identify the weight of plastic that could also be exempted from this. So a lot of people might have noticed that their plastic bags at the grocery store suddenly got really thick. And so those were changes that were not necessarily ideal, but it still allowed us to pass something. So if you have an issue that's not just, limited to your neighborhood, building coalitions outside of your neighborhood is really helpful as well. But again, I would encourage everybody to start with their own city councilor. There might be cases where that counselor's positions don't necessarily align, and they might not be interested. And I would say at that point, it's not inappropriate to contact another counselor who you think might be willing to support, but always contact your own counselor first. And sometimes the counselor will recommend, go ahead and talk to these others just to start to build that coalition of support for it. But yeah, that was a really interesting one because it was.
Well, and I love that. I love that the suggestion actually came from school kids. It just kind of goes to show that, you can get ideas for legislation from literally anywhere, anyone, maybe even people you didn't expect, because I don't think a lot of us think that school children are necessarily thinking about things like that, but it's awesome that they are. So that's cool. Thank you. Thank you for that, Diane. I appreciate that. I wanted to actually address this question to Tom and to Julia. Who can actually propose legislation? Is it citizens? Is it the city council? Is it the mayor? Is it all three?
And Julia, I'll let you start with it, and I'll follow up with a little bit of background on how it happens.
Sure. So as has been stated, the development of legislation often occurs as a result of issues being raised by citizens. The mayor's office can also provide suggestions or requests to the council about legislation they're interested in. And then, of course, the council comes up with legislation on its own. But ultimately, only the city council can introduce legislation and start the process of formally moving a bill forward. Like even when the administration proposes something, a councilor ultimately has to sponsor that bill for it to sort of get rolling.
Okay.
And I would just add that The form that you could propose it is varies. And I think that some of that, I think when Diane and Chris and Jillian were going through through their experiences, the form that it comes can vary. It can sometimes just be a discussion with the counselor, and the counselor will call one of the people here in the audience and in the panel to go ahead and start working on some legislation, or it could be an email. Also, you could maybe, sometimes a group will present a report that they've done, particularly if it's a nonprofit. And sometimes other nonprofits who have access to legal representation, they'll actually have them prepare a draft ordinance, or if it's particularly an ordinance, and then that will go over to somebody like Julia, who will then take and kind of prepare it for the standards that the city uses. So there's various forms it can come into, but like Julia said, ultimately it comes down to just the council can introduce resolution, an ordinance or legislation.
Okay.
If I can piggyback real quick on that.
Sure.
So another way, if it's not a group that has access to, lawyers or somebody who is skilled in drafting legislation, another thing that the average citizen can do, if there's a topic you're interested in, or of a law in Denver or New Orleans, wherever it might be that you think is a good idea, you can also submit just a copy of that as an example to the counselor. Now, we're going to have to abide obviously by our own state and local rules, but that's a good way to start, to sort of get it started. I really like that Denver has this law. Send a copy of it to your counselor and say, hey, is there something, can we do something like this here?
Okay. Oh, see, if that's something else I didn't realize that people could do. That's a great idea, Diane. Okay. Thank you for that. That's actually, and that is actually a really good segue into my next question. Actually for you, Diane, what is the citizens' role in legislation being drafted beyond what you were just talking about after they have made the suggestion to their city councilor?
So that can vary. Typically, and I think Julia, you may have mentioned this too, Vanessa, the actual drafting of the legislation is done by the counselors and council staff working together, and definitely with our legal advisors assisting and making sure that we're not going somewhere that we can't. So typically that draft is going to be done by council, whether, all of those people that are involved. And most of the time it will be then introduced. And so the public involvement typically begins more at that point. Once the bill's been introduced and it goes to committee and it goes to council, there's opportunity for the public to either via email, the website, public comment at a meeting, phone calls, for them to give their thoughts and suggestions on, what they think we might change throughout this process, because it can be amended. There are other times as well where we need to work either more closely with the citizen group. There might be a little back and forth in advance of the introduction of a bill. Are we getting, are we heading in the right direction here? Is this what you were wanting to do? And that happens a lot with advocacy groups. So another example was the minimum wage ordinance, and that was brought to us by more of a professional group, an advocacy organization, and they had what they wanted that they presented to us, and we did do some discussions back and forth, drafts back and forth based on the types of legal limitations, and also again wanting to have something that we felt could pass. But mostly the citizen involvement occurs once the bill gets introduced. And for the most part, I think most ordinances and even resolutions, they're not introduced with the assumption that this is it and this is how it's going to be passed. That's why we have the public process. If it's something that there's a lot of interest in and a lot of comment and that's sort of complicated, the committee can hold it for additional hearings at the committee. The council can have more than one hearing. But again, that public process is really where most of the input gets involved. We're certainly going to stay in touch and make sure those folks that brought the idea to us know where we're at. They know when it's introduced. We will, help guide them and advise them on what their involvement can be as far as getting support from the counselor. And that usually involves getting your neighbors or other interested parties
Sure.
to make those phone calls or send those emails or show up at the meetings.
Yep, that makes sense. Get as many people in support of it as you possibly can. So, Tom, I wanted to ask something that kind of occurred to me when I was talking with Diane. Are there examples of legislation that don't go through committee before they go to full council, or do they all have to go through one or other committees before going to the full council? This is just something that I just realized I didn't know the answer to.
Sure. And I'll start off then, Julia, if you want to follow up with some more of the detail. What it is yes, you can, there's two ways you can do it. And that is one, when you introduce a bill, usually what will happen is, and I'll give you the kind of rundown, is that the clerk will ask the counselor to ask them how they want the bill to proceed. And they can either say, send it to committee, which almost always means going to the Finance Government Operations Committee, the Land Use Planning and Zoning Committee. And that is assigned to committee based on their subject matter.
Mm-hmm.
And the committee names pretty much indicate what goes. Almost all operations of the city business, almost all bills will go to FGO. Bills concerning land use and planning and zoning will of course go towards the LUPS, but everything else goes to FGO. Those are the two committees we have. We also have a third committee called Public Safety, which regards bills. I don't know if it requires the budget bills of public safety, but the policies of the fire and police department. And Chris staffs that and give us some background on that one. So that's one way they can do it. Second way the council can add, if they have kind of a rush on it, they can ask the council can ask the council president if they can designate it as a holdover. And what that means is that it's introduced at the first meeting, let's say on a Monday night, and then it goes to, and it's held over for the second meeting, does not go to council. Usually though, what the counselor has to do is they have to kind of give a reason to that, to the council president for the reason, and that's the council president's discretion whether or not they want it as holdover. The same thing can be on the administration can do the same thing. When they find a counselor to sponsor their bill by request, they can also ask for the council president for holdover. And if the council who's sponsoring it and the council president agree, then they go for holdover. And then the most sudden way to do it is a bill for immediate action. And I do believe, and that's where I think, Julie, you may have to help me on, I think the votes, I believe they can at the council meeting ask that it be heard at the council meeting it's introduced. And I believe during introductions, and I believe they bring up the bill, and I believe it has to have 6 votes. Is that correct? I can't remember if it's or Diane or somebody's at 6 or 7. I think it's 6.
It has, right. So basically they're suspending the rules that require it to either be held over or go to committee, and they have to have 6 votes to suspend that rules to allow it to be heard that night.
That night. It's also hold for holdover too that night. Didn't realize that. So it's held, so it's gone for, they suspend it and they hear it that night. So that is I think the primary ways that it can be, that you can proceed the bill through the process.
Okay.
On that one though, I guess I do have to be careful. If it's an ordinance, I'm not fully aware if an ordinance can be held over. I think that might have to be held for 2 weeks because there's a legal publishing requirement on that, correct?
That's right. Yeah, that's the only thing that I would add is that ordinances are treated a little bit differently and have special notice requires procedurally that they have to follow.
Okay. Okay, cool. Thank
One
you.
note on that is occasionally if a counselor has enough advance notice to the clerk that they want to introduce an ordinance and they want to hold over, an ordinance could really never be done immediate action. But if they're trying to go for a holdover, they would have to have the title prepared and to the city clerk in time to advertise it in the journal 2 weeks before the hearing. So basically that means technically it would be advertised before its introduction. But like Julia said, there's a 14-day legal advertising requirement. So typically ordinances are never held over, but on occasion, if there's a counselor who sees a need to sort of rush it, they can get that advertising done before it actually even gets introduced. But that's a pretty rare occurrence. So it did just happen recently, but it is.
Okay, great. Again, more all this is all good information for me. I'm sure it's good information for others too. Lots of stuff that I didn't know. Eric, I wanted to ask you from a citizen standpoint. I understand you were the driving force behind the hold on a second. Let me look at the community benefits agreement that was part of the recent stadium bond ballot question. And I wanted to ask you what just basically, how did you go about bringing that to the attention of the council?
Good. I'll get the blame for it because it didn't go.
I don't mean it like that at all. I
No,
really
it's a
think
great lesson, actually.
Yeah.
We, again, no original ideas. This actually, there were some folks I live in the Panelists neighborhood and active in a couple of community groups, and there were some folks over at one of the community organizations called the Panelists Community Coalition that were talking about a similar proposal in Nashville, and again, like there are very few original ideas for legislation. So if ideally another city or another state, another community has done something like that. So we thought they went through it. We reached out to the gentleman who had worked on it and found out there was a whole bunch of examples of this, right? So so we started working on it, given that Panelists was one of the proposed or potential locations for the stadium. And it's a great example of, I think, what you're trying to do, Vanessa, which is how do you, in a much more structural way, incorporate community. So I think we've all talked about some great ways for people to plug in, but to be honest, there are very few structural ways for community to plug in, because we don't hire lobbyists. I mean, I don't have a lobbyist. I don't know if maybe other people on the call do, but like, so you have to you can't afford to pay somebody to be going to every council meeting and to be paying attention to the agenda. So so ideally, what happens is you have to really kind of work with a group of people, look at what other cities are doing. And in this case, when we found out there was a possibility, a group of folks got together, and because we had an ongoing, not just me, but the community had an ongoing relationship with Councilor Benton, they felt comfortable talking. So we started talking to him, and he was willing to do it. We were also talking to the mayor's folks about, like, because that's the other thing I think was mentioned a couple of times. You know, the city council is the legislative body for local government, right? Just like we have a national government, state government, this is the legislative body, the governing body, but there's also another branch of government. And, you know, ultimately we have a strong mayor form of government in Albuquerque, which means the mayor can veto things. And so that's not the case in Santa Fe, that's not the case in Las Cruces, but here it is. So you have to make sure you're also just not relying on your city councilor to make sure that the mayor's folks and the mayor is on board with this. And so we were talking to both the councilor and the mayor's folks. Let me tell you the lesson that we learned is we made a decision about our community that really was driving this to try to, because we were one of the selected sites, we did not do a good enough job in reaching out to other neighborhoods because we had a different viewpoint. We weren't for it or against it. We wanted a community conversation that was deep, that really could talk about, okay, what are some ways we can make it help our community? Not every neighborhood was in that position, as some of you know. So we could have, as a neighborhood and as individuals, could have done a better job of talking to some other neighborhoods to see if they could get on board, because I'm concerned that a CBA is a really good way to get community at the table for big decisions, not just on stadiums, but on, you know, development projects, on you know, what do we do at the new shelter that's being proposed in Southeast. So it's a good model, and I'm worried that it may be because we didn't do as much outreach as we should have, that people are going to sort of have a bad taste in their mouth. Well, CBAs are really not the way to go, and I think they are the way to go. They're really good ways to bring community members, individuals, neighborhoods to the table with some real thought and weight in the process, so that you're not just hoping the city government does the right thing, but you actually have a seat at the table, or the developer does the right thing, or New Mexico United, or whoever, that you actually have a process that says community will have literally a designated seat at the table as you make these decisions that are going to affect traffic and crime and noise and all the things we care about as, you know, as members of the community.
Yeah, thank you for that. That was a really good explanation of it. It was, you know, it's not something that I knew a whole lot about, even reading up on it. So I appreciate you breaking it down. And you know, I think it's always a good idea to bring as many people into the discussion as possible. You know, you're always going to get those different viewpoints. And like Diane made the very good point, you know, anytime you're, you know, going to enact legislation, you're always going to have some level of compromise. So that seems like a good way to bring it about. So thank you for that, Eric. I appreciate it. I wanted to address this next question to actually Eric, Julian, and Chris. Eric, you've already kind of addressed it a little bit, but what are some other suggestions for ways that individuals and other community groups can become more involved in the civic process. For example, and we talked about this a little bit with the plastic bag ban, if a younger individual, a high school student, et cetera, wanted to suggest new legislation, what would be some good ways to go about that? And I'm thinking specifically of the recent zero transit fare. It's my understanding that was spearheaded by the group Together for Brothers. And so, Julian, do you want to jump in here?
Sure. Yeah. I think the main point of the story too is that I think city councilors and other legislative bodies, they want to know what works. And so in this case, Together for Brothers was doing some work at Highland High School. Some students said that they had some issues getting to school. And so they had an idea to get the students free bus passes to allow them to get to school safely and on time, and those other kind of things. It was highly successful. These students got to school on time. Their grades improved. Their engagement in school improved. And so from that idea, it turned into a bigger idea of going and trying that at like a citywide level. If we can get people to work on time, if we can get people to their doctor's appointments on time and safely, that has other benefits that ripple out from that program. So that's a good example of just something that comes from the community, but it's also a demonstrable success. And I think kind of Eric got at this a little bit earlier. If you're a city councilor, you want to know what works, and you want kind of just the proof that works, and you can bring that program to them, then it makes the council look better too.
Yeah, for sure. Chris?
A lot has been said here today, and a recurring theme is, there are groups and others that you could approach to do this. But, if you're an individual and you're not affiliated with anything, I would just ask yourself some key questions like, what are you interested in? And what would you specifically do to do something about it? And how would you become the expert on this? Like, say you like water policy, maybe you need to write letters to the editor talking about water, get attention to yourself, build this momentum, join a board or commission, because the counselors listen to their boards and commissions. In fact, one of the items not too long ago on the council agenda, they were listening to the Open Space Advisory Board, and the Open Space Advisory Board folks talked about things that they were concerned about because of a bill based on council. And it's just, there's so many ways you can get involved, and that's the beauty of having this webinar today, and I appreciate you doing it. One piece of advice that I would give folks is nail down your elevator speech. I mean, it doesn't have to be the elevator speech, but counselors and council policy analysts and staff see a lot of different legislation. As Eric said, there's no new ideas. We get bombarded with several ideas. Work on a one pager that you can present to the counselor or council staff that, hey, this is a good idea. Sometimes if it goes too long, it gets lost your main point.
Yeah. No, and that you make a good point, Chris, that, volunteering, being on a board or a commission is it's another really excellent way to become engaged in the civic process. And I think we forget that, people of all ages can get involved in all these different types of boards and commissions. If young kids, that's always something I think about, because I have nephews and niece, and I always think about, how can I interest them in stuff like that? So that's a good suggestion. Thank you for that, Chris.
And I just came up with this, and I'm not sure, maybe the others on this call can answer, but I don't think that there's an age limit for being on a board. I mean, it's just a matter of being a subject matter expert on what you're interested in.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. I can check and I can find out, but I'm thinking of I believe there's a mayor. The mayor has a youth advisory council. That's one that comes to mind right away. So yeah, okay, that's a great suggestion for that, Chris. I appreciate it. Thank you. Did I miss anything? Is there anything anybody else wants to add before we get to the panel question?
I had a question for you, Vanessa. I actually don't know the answer to that question either. So if you can share when you've done your research. I know, for example, the Senior Affairs Advisory Board, I'm pretty sure you have to be a senior, but in the Youth Advisory Council, you have to be a youth. But that's a great question, and I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah.
If there's if
Yep.
the other boards have an age limitation.
I'll get that information for sure. Not to worry, and I'll let all of our panelists and our attendees know. We do have one
Vanessa,
question. Go ahead, Tom.
Real quick, there's one thing I would add before, as we kind of wrap, as come to an end. I'm
Sure.
following back up on what Eric said about he setting up a process to go ahead and help foster your legislation through. That's a good step also, because I think to remember, once you succeed and you pass the ordinance, you pass the resolution or the memorial, it's not a living being, it's just a piece of paper. It takes a constituency to make it, keep it alive, and to actually see it to be implemented, what it's about. The best examples I can give is, one is an example where it didn't happen. I think, Eric, when you had some people come to you back when you were a counselor to pass a pedestrian safety and kind of pedestrian activity zone at Avenida Cesar Chavez and University, which is a great place for it. There's great need. But I think there's no constituency, and once you left, there's nobody really to follow up because they're not around it. In contrast, and I think there are a couple of areas that you have worked on, Eric, that have continued on. The one I think of is two of them that I think of that had constituencies that became thriving. One was the 12th and Manal area, the redevelopment of the Albuquerque Indian School. There was a group of neighbors who many years ago, starting back in the, I think, mid-1990s, realized it was closing, and they kind of formed a coalition and have worked over the years. I think Diane worked many years with them to go ahead and see a plan implemented that worked well. And they worked through their city councilor, and the city worked with the federal government and the Indian Pueblos to kind of come up with a plan. And they have stayed with it consistently through a number of councilors to see it implemented. And that's why when you go over there nowadays, you see besides the Pueblo Cultural Center, you see a fairly good looking development and a series of developments that's more pedestrian friendly and will have a mix of uses. It's because I think their constituency. And then of course, the best example I can give is the Petroglyph National Monument. That started out as a group of people coming to a councilor back in 1985 for the city to get involved. And that grew into a national monument. And those people have stayed on with it for, I think some of them now in their 70s and 80s, they've still stayed with it and continue to see the monument grow. The other thing I'd point out about that is, so I think that's critical to making it, to seeing it through. The other thing I'd point out to you is not to get discouraged if there's just a few people. Both those examples I gave that have succeeded, it's just been a small group of 4 or 5 people have stuck with it through the years. They've been able to get it done. So I think those are two things to remember, that if you're going to propose legislation, it's not just a matter of getting it passed, it's going to be a matter of staying with it and helping, kind of thinking of it as a child. You're going to have to raise it and grow it into where it ultimately can become.
Yeah, and that's actually good for people to remember as well, because because of the, we all know that, city councilors are elected, every, certain amount of years. And so there's always going to be changes to how the city council functions. But if there's a devoted group of people who are willing to stick with their legislation through, through new councilors, I think that's a really good reminder, Tom, of that's the way to keep something going. And I appreciate that. Thank you. We have time for a couple of panel questions before we end. We have a question from Patty Wilson. This one's probably going to be more for Julia. Please explain the quasi-judicial concept, often a response from a counselor about why they can't speak to a specific issue.
Sure. So quasi-judicial refers to a proceeding that's conducted by the council that's similar to like a traditional court proceeding where the council is the decision maker. And a counselor might not want to talk to a constituent about an issue related to one of these quasi-judicial proceedings because, just like a judge, they aren't permitted to consider information outside of the record or communicate with people on either side of an issue. And that's because of their responsibility to be impartial and only consider appropriate information in reaching their decision on whatever the issue is about.
And Julia, is that, I know historically, well, that does always apply to land use appeals,
Right.
Specifically, because that is a hearing. Does that quasi-judicial apply really to any other topics that the council hears outside? Like, I know also like small zoning areas. So not to bring up the IDO discussion, but in general, changes to the zoning code or the IDO that are citywide is considered legislative, so they can have those conversations. But if we're looking at like the upcoming community planning areas, which only affect a smaller, is that sort of like the line between whether or not they can have those conversations?
Yeah, I think you can think of it as like the line being drawn between like big picture legislation versus case by case or individual disputes.
Okay. Thank you, Julia. I appreciate that. The quasi judicial question is sometimes very confusing for me as well. So that very helpful. So this is very educational for me. I'm gonna go think, my head's gonna explode from all this new knowledge. So thank you guys all very much. Thank you, all of you, Julia, Julian, Chris, Diane, Eric, Tom, for taking the time to be part of this panel. I wish we could talk longer. I know you're all busy and have commitments at 1 o'clock, but this was really interesting for me. I hope our attendees enjoyed it. Thank you. Thank you for the questions, Patty. I really appreciate everybody taking the time. Did anybody have anything else that they wanted to add specific to our discussion? No? All right, I will get the answer to the question about the age limit for being on a board or commission. Otherwise, we are done. Thanks for attending this last session of the year, and maybe I'll see you guys in 2022 on another panel.
Thank you, Vanessa. Thanks, everybody. Good
Thank
to see
you.
you all.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
everyone.
Thanks,
Thanks for
Vanessa.
having me, Vanessa.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you, my attendees.
Thank you.